Hello, this is the charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade! Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. The image on the screen depicts the Light Brigade, so called because they were fleet of foot, because they were highly skilled, because there weren't that many of them. They were light, comparatively light, only 600, and because they rode on horse. They weren't terribly well equipped, but they were incredibly well skilled. If you click on the link at the top there, you'll have another reading of the poem set to the film version of The Charge of the Light Brigade. So there was a film made in the 1960s, and the poem is overlaid over the sort of famous battle scene, which depicts what happens in the poem. And what does happen in the poem? Well, the plot of the poem is essentially this. In the first stanza, we see the soldiers riding forwards. In the second stanza, they continue to ride forwards. A problem has occurred, an error, a blunder, but the soldiers carry on because that's their job. It's not their job to make reply. It's not their job to reason why. It's just their job to do and die. They are dutiful and courageous, and they are patriotic, and they fight for a cause grander than themselves. They don't question why they're doing it. The third stanza depicts them entering the war zone, really, the area of conflict. The cannon to the right, the cannon to the left, the cannon in front of them. They're charging forwards, and they're coming under fire, stormed at with shot and shell. The fourth stanza, you'll notice, is the longest in the poem, and that's because this is where all the conflict actually occurs. This is the stanza of the fighting. And what we will see, and what we do see, is endless amounts of violence, numerous violent verbs being used in this particular stanza. The fifth stanza depicts retreat. And we get that from the third line of the fifth stanza, cannon to right, cannon to left, but now it's cannon behind them, because now they are retreating, they are heading back from where they came. And the final stanza, the sixth stanza, essentially is a call to arms. The poet asks the reader to remember them, to honour them, to ensure that these men who give their lives for something grander than themselves are commemorated. And so one of the essential ideas of this poem is whether or not the charge of the Light Brigade is excessively romanticised, excessively glorified. Alfred Lord Tennyson asks us to commemorate, to remember, to honour these soldiers. And he does it for good reason, but is it a kind of is it appropriate to glorify death in such a way, particularly considering that the death doesn't appear to be their fault? When you come to write about the poem, there are certain words which have a higher tariff, as it were. They're more valuable. And on the left-hand side, these are words which are arguably themes and ideas of the poem. You'll see that the word is written in its numerous forms so that you can apply the word in the most appropriate way. So if you wanted to speak about Tennyson's glorification of the soldiers, well, then you'd use the middle one. However, if you wanted to refer to how the soldiers carry out their duty, because they are patriotic, you'll see how we're beginning to sort of maneuver and manipulate the different word classes to suit us, to suit your writing. In the orange box, you'll see these are the words which are technical vocabulary. So these are poetic devices that are used within the poem. On their own, not very interesting. The key is, well, what's the significance of them? And we'll go through those as we look on. The other thing to make sure that you're aware of is some context. I'm not a history teacher. I'm not going to dwell too much on the history of the Crimean War, but experience dictates that teachers like me will mention the Crimean War, and students may not necessarily have an idea of what that is or where it is. So we are over here. If you look at the mouse, we are over here just north of London for us. This is the UK. The Crimea is this little part just over here. That is the Crimea. And essentially, you'll notice that it has lots of larger, more sort of powerful countries sort of circulating, they're around it. This particular war, the Crimean War, is from 1853 to 1856. At the time, your sort of significant powers were in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and then the Russians, led by, at this stage, still the Tsars. And if you want to know more about some of the history, then I would encourage you to go and look at this particular link. It's very short, it's really quite simple, very much a simplified animated version of the Crimean War. Probably not the type of thing your history teachers would necessarily push you towards, but as an English teacher, it gives you an idea of the Crimean War without prioritizing the context. Because when we're looking at poetry, the most important thing is always the ideas. So the only context that I'm going to really tease out are these three things here. The Crimean War was one where Britain, along with France and some other sort of allied countries, joined with the Ottoman Empire against the Russians to maintain an equilibrium. Essentially, they didn't want the Russians to become too powerful. Alfred Lord Tennyson, he was writing his poem back in the UK. He was what's called the poet laureate. Perhaps the easiest way to describe the poet laureate is they are the national poet. It's a paid job. Their function is to write poems of national significance about events of the day. So within the collection of Power and Conflict, a couple of poets spring to mind because they are also poet laureates. Ted Hughes was the poet laureate. Carol Ann Duffy was the poet laureate until very recently. Simon Armitage is now the poet laureate. And perhaps a good example of this would be to consider, well, Simon Armitage in this time of the pandemic has been writing poems about the pandemic. Carol Ann Duffy wrote poems about national events such as the wedding of William, future king, to Kate, Catherine Middleton, and the Olympics and things like that. So the poet laureate's job is to write poems of national significance. And Tennyson here writes about the Crimean War from his base in England, from his remote, from his distanced perspectives. ultimately, the Crimean War was a hollow victory for Britain because, well, while they, inverted commas, won, the Ottoman Empire did defeat the Russians. For Britain, there wasn't really much gained. From a military perspective, we were demonstrably weaker. Too many soldiers died, not even in conflict. There wasn't really very much to gain from it. However, as the poet laureate, Alfred Lord Tennyson's function is not necessarily to go around criticising his government. Probably not the wisest thing to do. And instead, he has to tiptoe along this fine line of glorifying the soldiers and celebrating their courage, their honour, their bravery, their patriotism, their heroism, if I haven't said that one already. And any criticism he may have has to be really quite subtle. So this poem falls very much within the conflict section of Power and Conflict. This is about the conflict of soldiers and how the soldiers are affected by conflict. So very much a question about conflict and the effects of conflict. The question we're going to work towards is this one. How does Tennyson present the soldiers in The Charge of the Light Brigade? A reasonably simple poem, and a reasonably simple question in response to the poem. One that we could be tweaked and made more challenging quite easily. I'll give you a couple of verbal examples. How does Tennyson present the effects of conflict on soldiers in The Charge of the Light Brigade? There's one way of making it slightly more difficult. One other way that we can potentially make it slightly more difficult would be, how does Tennyson present the glory of war in The Charge of the Light Brigade? Again, a slightly more complex question because it's requiring you to consider the extent to which there is any glory in war. Okay, now it's at this stage that I'm going to use these words here in orange and these words here in green when discussing the poem, which we're going to do now. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. What we have here is dactylic dimeter. So you'll be familiar at this stage with iambic pentameter and iambic tetrameter. Well, dactylic dimeter is a sort of another form of meter, obviously enough, the word meter's in it, that poets will sometimes use. A dactyl is a dum diddy. Dum diddy. I'm just shouting the word dumb at you at this stage. What we have here is half, which is stressed, a league. Half a league. So a dactyl is where we have the first word is stressed, and then the second two words are unstressed. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600. Now, essentially, what we're having here is the creation of a particular rhythm. Dum diddy, 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 dum. That was fun. What we're doing, what Tennyson is doing, is using poetic meter to mirror the sound of the horses as they enact their charge, as they go on their charge. And what we have also is this sense of relentless momentum being created. It's quite pleasing to the ear. It's quite a nice thing to listen to. Maybe not if I'm yelling dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy at you, but there's a repetition of the meter, at least at this stage in the poem. So that's the first thing. The dactylic dimeter that runs throughout much of the poem is used to create relentless momentum and to parallel, to mirror, to echo, to symbolize the movement of the Light Brigade on their horses towards the Russians. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade. Charge for the guns, he said. I'm yelling it because they are being delivered an instruction on a battlefield by their commanding officer. But who the he is unspoken. Somebody has made a mistake, we're told that in a line or two. But the poet laureate, the national poet, is not going to name and shame whoever it is who has made a catastrophic error that leads to the deaths of most of these soldiers. So this he is left unsaid. Now you'll see here that I've underlined all in the valley of death. And what we have, and the reason I've underlined it, I should say, is because of its allusion to religious and biblical text. It comes from Psalm 23, and it's really rather a famous line in the Bible. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now in full, Psalm 23 is this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, I don't mind saying that if I were ever in a conflict, I'd be pretty terrified. But for these men, the Lord is their shepherd. They believe in a God who has brought them to this place. They believe in a God who is their protector. Therefore, Tennyson is insinuating that these men do not fear anything because the Lord is their shepherd, because the Lord is on their side. And with the Lord on your side, the valley of death holds no fear. You'll note here that I've also underlined the last line of the stanza because this is a refrain that's repeated. Repetition is used throughout the charge of the Light Brigade, I can say it. Repetition is used throughout the charge of the Light Brigade to reinforce the relentlessness of what they go through, the momentum of their propulsion towards conflict. Refrains, typically a feature of song, but spoken in poetry as well, and repeated in poetry, in this instance to highlight, well, in the first stanza how there are 600, but then in the latter stanzas how are not 600, how that number is one that decreases throughout the poem and throughout the battle. We'll notice also how each of the stanzas is numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each of those numbers supposedly representing 100 of the soldiers. Forward the Light Brigade, Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Now, the historians suggest that someone who blundered was Lord Cardigan, but it wasn't really just his fault. Essentially, it was the miscommunication in the chain of command. One soldier says, charge, one soldier says, don't charge. One soldier is sort of bloodthirsty, the other one is not. Miscommunication is often what leads to fatality. Those of you who study Romeo and Juliet will perhaps see how that's the case. But someone had blundered, and that's really important, because these men are seen to die because they are courageous, because they are heroic, because they are patriotic, but they had no need to die. And maybe that's why we should remember them also, is that it was a kind of senseless death. Their heroism, their bravery, their honor, their courage are elevated because it was a pointless death. It's almost a sacrifice. We have a different type of repetition here, anaphora. Anaphora being where the same words are used at the beginning of a series of clauses. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Not their job, said this already, not their job to answer back, not their job to question anything, just their job to follow those instructions. More anaphora. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. And it's here where we begin to see the violent verbs. Volleyed, thundered, stormed. And what are they stormed with? Artillery fire. We have men on horseback. Maybe a saber, some kind of sword in their hand, charging towards the enemy who got cannons. Essentially, it leads to massacre. And now I'm writing down other key words that could potentially be useful for you in any piece of writing you ever do on this poem. Man on a horseback with a sword up against a cannon. Well, guess what? He doesn't stand a chance. It leads to a massacre. These men are sacrificing themselves, and there doesn't appear to be a particularly good reason for it. The blunder has led to this error. As alluded to previously, the fourth stanza is the one with the most lines, because it is the site of conflict. This is where the violence occurs. And you'll see here that I've again made note of the violent verbs. They flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Now, beyond the violence, this line here about the world wondering is Tennyson's allusion, his reference here to the remoteness of most people. This is 1855, sorry, when this particular battle actually occurred. No mobile phones, no technology. Letters would have taken weeks to reach the UK from just south of Russia, just north of Turkey, a couple of thousand miles away. Information would have reached people in Britain incredibly slowly. So therefore, all the world wants to know what's going on. Families would want to know what's happened to their loved ones, presumably, but they can't know. So the remote nature of this war is being made apparent, but it's also a war which was unusual because, well, some have suggested it was the sort of first media war. It was the first war where there was any kind of reporting on it at all. So incredibly remote reporting, but perhaps the first media war. Some people say that it is the first media war, and they're very assertive about it. Well, I'm not a historian, so perhaps I shouldn't quibble with it. But generally, the lot of the student of English is to report things somewhat tentatively. Perhaps most significantly, Tennyson wants to know what's going on. This has happened, and the world is almost unaware. That's the point of this. It's the fact that the world around them are unaware of this particular conflict. And Tennyson wants to change that. He wants the reader of his time to be aware of the sacrifice that these men have made. They plunged through the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Wow, that's amazing, isn't it? They've actually broken through the line of the enemy with cannons. It's phenomenal. They're not just brave soldiers, they're highly skilled soldiers. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. So here, we see how the refrain has changed. And the repetition of not is telling us of the death of these soldiers. The fifth stanza was retreat, as said previously, cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them. Volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. Tennyson is unambiguous. In his language choice. If you are unambiguous, you are assertive, you are making a statement. And he is unambiguous because this is a statement of fact now. These men are heroes. They did fight well. They came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. Now, I haven't alluded to this previously. What we have here is, and the different color is just to distinguish it on your screens and your texts, personification. Well, hell is personified as having a mouth, that they have been consumed by it, but so brave, so courageous, so phenomenal a soldier are these men that they are able to come back from hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? So what we have here are rhetorical questions, because the answer is never. Their glory can never fade. But just in case we don't understand that it's meant to be rhetorical, he answers it anyway. Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. And now what we have here are declarative statements. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade. Noble 600. The use of the exclamation mark helps to make this not just a declaration, but a proclamation. What's the difference? Well, I tend to think a proclamation has a slightly more biblical connotation. And if we go and proclaim something, we tell it to others. If we declare something, we're just stating it. But if we proclaim it, we tell it to others. And that's the message of this particular poem. Tennyson wants to proclaim. He wants to tell the message, the story of these soldiers to others, so that their sacrifice, so that their honour, so that their courage, so that their patriotism is not forgotten. He glorifies these soldiers in part because what they do is sort of otherworldly. It's admirable in so many ways. And the sacrifice that they make is not, it's not their fault. It's people more powerful than them in the chain of command who make decisions, mistakes that lead to their deaths. And therefore, we must tell it to others so that nobody forgets. Nobody forgets their sacrifice. Now, there are one or two words that I haven't quite alluded to, and I'll just quickly cover those now. Refrain, we see that, and I'll go over each of them. We see the refrain at the end of each stanza. We see anaphora with canon to right of them, canon to left of them, canon in front of them. The repetition of both refrain and anaphora helps to create that sense of relentlessness as they move towards their enemy. The biblical allusion to the Lord is my shepherd tells us that these soldiers perceive that they have nothing to fear. Death and hell are personified to exaggerate, perhaps, the glory of the soldiers. The dactylic dimeter, dum diddy, dum diddy, dum diddy, dum, reinforces the sense of repetition that's occurring throughout all of the poem. Where does that dactylic dimeter break down? It breaks down in the fourth stanza, so in the sight of conflict. Onomatopoeia, haven't said anything about yet. The onomatopoeia of words like shot and shell, stormed at with shot and shell, helps to accentuate the violence of the conflict. The third person narrator, perhaps best exemplified through phrases like all the world wondered, helps to show that Tennyson is sort of distant, he is remote from the conflict itself. And as a consequence of being a third person narrator, perhaps he is able to celebrate the soldiers, criticize, implicitly criticize those who lead, and encourage us, the reader, in the 1850s and now, whenever it is that we read it, to honor, to remember, to celebrate, to commemorate these soldiers who give their lives. Use this video to have a go at answering that question there about how Tennyson presents the soldiers and the effects of conflict in the charge of the Light Brigade. Annotate incredibly carefully, ask questions if you have them. That's it for this particular video. Until the next one, thanks very much. Bye-bye.